Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I think we're about 5 minutes late. We were waiting, making sure everybody comes, but we will get started just to make sure we get the most of the hour we have together. Very excited to have this group together for the first time to talk about sanctions and what we're seeing here. We have a good representation across the bank and folks from PwC, from US and Canada talking about different topics. The way we thought, and hopefully this is one of the many sessions we do, so the way we thought the discussion will go today is a bit of a panel. So we've divided it into 3 different sections. Let's set it up as a bit more of a general trend of where we see sanctions and the environment headed, and then talk about specific issues and so forth. And let's keep it interactive. You have mics in front of you. If you have questions, please press the button and jump right in. Let's keep this interactive, of course. We'll start with a quick intro. My name is Sandeep Theeman. I'm a partner in the financial services consulting practice here, leading the regulatory compliance and financial crimes practice, and deal with a lot of issues around just compliance, AML, and some of the more relevant headlines these days that we see in the newspaper. So I'll pass it on to Dan and Fred, for the introduction of the bank. Thanks.
And hi there, I'm Dan Tannenbaum. I'm the partner in AML and sanctions practice in PwC US. I also serve as the network's global sanctions leader, so I spend a lot of time on planes. And I'm in the running, hopefully, to count the Oscars for next year, so fingers crossed. In a past life,
You'll get the good end, not the bad.
Right. In a past life, I was at the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the U.S. Treasury Department. That's how I got into this space. I also spent time at the New York Fed, and for a time, actually 3 years, I worked at 100 Young Street, where I was the Chief Compliance Officer for the Americas at TravelX, as well as TravelX's Global Head of Sanctions. So I spend the bulk of my time doing a variety of crisis management exercises in the sanctions and AML space with FS and also non-FS companies, large technology, e-commerce, social media companies that are beginning to understand that they have obligations that they have to comply with as well. So I'm looking forward to the dialogue this morning.
I'm Fred Miller. I'm here in Toronto now, but for many, many years I was in the Washington, D.C. office of PwC and ran globally the anti-bribery, anti-corruption program and deal with clients of all stripes, FS, non-FS, who run into problems with sanctions and anti-bribery, anti-corruption issues wherever and whenever. And at last count, I've done work in 67 countries, but who's counting? From that perspective, we'll hopefully be able to give you a mix of the American and Canadian locations and issues that are coming up and the difference, and hopefully not too many differences between the two that we face. But like Dan, I think we're seeing more and more companies, non-FS, getting hip to this issue, shall we say, if one were to use that patois. And I think that, it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Thank you. So apart from the panelists in the room, we also have John Ingold and Ronnie Turner. Both of them play in the space of regulatory compliance as well as technology and how to enable some of the changes and transformation we'll talk about. So they will jump in as needed for questions. Okay, so with that, why don't we, first question to both of you, Fred and Dan. With a lot of changes happening, at least in the U.S. political environment, and it's especially the tone changing, and that'll have an impact globally in terms of how people think about sanctions and what are the implications on trade and banking and so forth. Let's set the context here. Let's set the background. What do you see happening? Where this is headed?
Yeah, so we did have an election.
You may have heard of that.
And there's certainly been some noise along the way around changes to the U.S. regulatory regime. Certainly this kind of 2-for-1 special for every one regulation going in, 2 have to go out, whatever that actually means. But certainly from a sanctions standpoint in the run-up for the election and actually a lot less so since the inauguration. There was a lot of talk around revising the approach that the Obama administration took on sanctions, most notably towards the end of the administration, the lifting of sanctions on Myanmar, the lifting of sanctions on Sudan, the easing of sanctions that had happened in multiple phases around Cuba, and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran that have obviously changed the landscape from a secondary sanction standpoint. Our views, and I was with some senior members of the Treasury Department yesterday in D.C., is nothing's going to change. One, I think it's pretty clear on the Russia point, there's very little appetite to do anything but keep things where they stand, if not go the other direction, let alone lift them. From an Iran standpoint, there's very little appetite in the global community to amend the work that was done with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and many view that the deal is actually working. Although I don't know if anyone's seen Homeland this season, and if they haven't, there's a good thread on the JCPOA, how the Iranians claimed they never even had nuclear weapons, and this is what they used to kind of evade sanctions relief. But there's very little desire to amend the current regime for a variety of reasons, many of which is the political appetite and the use of the sanctions as a foreign policy instrument to put sanctions back on Cuba after really a significant failure in that regime and how it was rolled out and what it was intended to do, which was get Castro out of power, which only galvanized his role over that country. I don't think you're going to see much change. What is a concern, certainly to folks in government, is what this new administration could use agencies like OFAC for. And certainly OFAC is an agency that's run through a variety of different regulations, the Trading with the Enemy Act, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Both are extremely old, but then also supplemented through presidential executive order, which this president really likes to use and use inappropriately. So how this gets rolled out is a concern. And one of the things that we've seen, there are no political appointees that are running the terrorism and financial intelligence regime in the government. Adam Zubin, who was the acting undersecretary after David Cohen left, who was the acting Treasury Secretary until Steve Mnuchin was confirmed, ran out of the building the moment Mnuchin was confirmed, as did most of the politicals that worked under him down to the Deputy Assistant Secretary level. So a lot of the people that had been there are gone. You have a lot of people in acting capacities. Now, that hasn't stopped enforcement actions from coming out. There was actually one yesterday against a medical device company. But what will come out of this is a bit unpredictable, much like everything else that's coming out of the administration today. There was talk yesterday where President Trump, which still pains me to even say, said that most of these political appointees weren't even necessary, which shows how little he even understands about the function of government. So I know, ironically, what I'm hearing from people, the non-politicals that remain, is that they're actually getting more done without the politicals in place. But, our prediction largely is that the regulatory enforcement regime, and if you look by the numbers, the last administration really upped the ante in terms of the size of penalties that had come out, particularly in the sanctions space. You had BNP Paribas, which was roughly $9 billion across multiple agencies. You had Commerzbank. You had a number of cases that were settled for very significant sums of money, and there's still 2 big bank sanctions cases that are outstanding, and this is all public. Unicredit and Societe Generale are the last 2 of the big bank stripping cases that have yet to settle. And I wouldn't necessarily look to that they have lesser violations than the other banks. Some of this is just a cadence issue in the government enforcement process. But I think the enforcement approach will still be there. How this manifests itself in terms of the type of penalties is a question. New York has already come out and graciously said that they will pick up the enforcement mantle for the rest of the government should the federal government decide to back down, which is great for everyone. But realistically, I think you're still going to see an enforcement mindset from a regulatory standpoint. If anything, I think there'll be more emphasis put on the AML regime in the U.S., and let's face it, the Bank Secrecy Act has been extremely static for the past 40-plus years. The OFAC regime has obviously been a dynamic regime, but in terms of the flexibility of change, it would be difficult to see what new things could be done at this point without a very strong reason for change to be put in place.
I guess what we're seeing, and perhaps you're seeing the same from the Canadian perspective, is that, number one, we're very happy to hear, I think, that Canada won't be alone in terms of the Russian sanctions in particular, because I think that there was a concern that if there was a back-off by the U.S., that there would be a great deal of Canada's alone fighting with the European Union, perhaps the Russians on sanctions. And so I think if that turns out to be true, and I always tell people I'm originally from Washington, so I say, well, let's wait and see, because I think it's pretty clear that Mr. Trump is a bit mercurial, at least President Trump, and he may do something one day and may not do the thing the next day. So we'll see what happens. But if in fact the Russian sanctions aren't seriously listed, I think that would be helpful towards the Canadian regime from the standpoint of we won't be out there alone. I think we hear that a lot. But also I think obviously there's a very high level of attention here about the real estate industry and financial services, AML, but really focusing now more on the real estate, and I think there's going to be a lot of that, and beneficial ownership being a real big issue. But sanctions have not been as right there on the forefront, and so I think there's a concern about that. And I also think that there's going to be increased interest with the passage of the approval now of CETA, of what happens, because a lot of companies and a lot of banks, by definition, are going to be involved in more trade across Canada, European trade, but that's going to lead to some interesting problems because, or interesting challenges, I think, and I think people are poised to say, okay, how is that going to affect our level? And, what we're seeing, and it's kind of a commercial here to a certain extent, but what we're seeing is more companies wanting to get business outside of Canada, but, that has a great opportunity, but a challenge at the same time.
So Fred, on that point, or John, maybe if you have any insights on this, how do you think the regulators, at least in Canada, are viewing or are planning for this a bit of an uncertain Trump era? And what we saw recently in the headlines from, is there the enforcement mindset coming in a little bit? What we saw, with Manulife disclosure, I think that something like that can happen to most institutions here. What's your reaction on that?
I think that, again, there's a big difference, at least we see a big difference between Canadian enforcement and U.S. enforcement. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. But at the same point in time, I think there is more of an appetite. But the real question is there, while there might be a bit more of an appetite, it's selective. And I think what we're also seeing is the fact that in addition to being selective, it really is much more of a challenge and a push because the mechanisms just aren't there. There's a lot of infrastructure, shall we say, in the U.S. enforcement machine that isn't in the Canadian machine right now. And, at the end of the day, you're going to have to perhaps try a case, and that involves a certain amount of level of proof, it's not preponderance of the evidence, et cetera. So I think from what we're seeing is while people are interested in doing it, I think the priorities are many, and the focus is really on issues relating to bigger pieces of the market.
Yeah. There was one thing I did want to add as I was thinking through it on Russia in particular, and our team's done work in Moscow on sanctions and on sectoral sanctions in Russia in the past year, including a 28-hour trip I took in the past 12 months. What's interesting and what we're beginning to see is that the Russian banks, both designated and non-designated banks, are beginning to comply with sectoral sanctions. So
who would have thought it?
I mean, I think the banking community, even the ones that are on the SSI list, have begun realizing that there's still a substantial amount of business that they can do around the world that isn't restricted by the sectoral sanctions regime, and they are going out of their way, which is actually a crime in Russia to comply with the U.S. and EU sectoral sanctions regime, to build out programs that are stopping transactions in Russia that would be totally legal, that don't conform to U.S. and EU standards. So, I mean, if that's a view towards think the appetite in Russia for where this is going, no one believes this is going away anytime soon, and we're actually seeing banks violate local law. And I had the chairman of one of the largest banks in Russia say to me, we're not so concerned with the local government, meaning the Putin government, which was an interesting reference.
Right.
They are willing to do this to maintain their global correspondent relationships, which I think is an interesting step to see, that they're acknowledging this is not just a fluke, this isn't something that's going to go away anytime soon, and they're trying to prepare for the long haul to maintain their presence.
Right. I've got a Russian client right now who is much more worried about what the SEC and the DOJ are going to do to them than they are with the Putin government. So, you know, go figure.
Excellent. Any questions from the participants here?
We hope that there's no change in a way, but you know, we just don't know, right? I mean, I guess the thing to say is our expectation is no change in the immediate time frame, but again, 140 characters could change that, right? You know, it could be just one tweet, and we could be off to the races.
That wall won't build itself, so everyone's focused on that. But I mean, in the use of sanctions have always been a political weapon, a foreign policy weapon, and unless there's a legitimate reason to go back into the programs, which in all of these cases, I don't think Cuba is posing a threat to the U.S. really. There's going to be little movement in these programs. It's not in the reversal of what's happening. In some of these instances, like Russia, it's possible that they could actually enhance the sanctions programs further, which there is a bipartisan effort in the U.S. underway to actually do just that and go beyond what the administration's saying and actually impose further sanctions. So it will be interesting to watch and see, but having worked in the machine of government and seen what's coming out from these programs, I mean, realistically, it would be tough to see this being a priority in the next month, but to Fred's point, who knows anymore.
Yeah, I think also Dan's point about the lack of staffing is incredibly important, at least from your standpoints, because there just aren't people there. I mean, it's a bit of a ghost town.
Well, that's also to note, if you're looking to hire, this is a great time. Lots of people are looking to leave the Treasury Department now in droves. Some of them are leaving without jobs. So if you are looking, this is an advertisement for my friends that are still remaining in government. You can get good people.
Right. It's amazing how few of the positions are filled and even in the pipeline to be filled. So it may be, you know, the next fiscal year before some of these positions get filled.
Excellent. Yeah, that's our next section. Stephen, you had a question? Do you want to hit that? Yeah.
A question about enforcement in the United States, because I mean, taking a step back and looking at it, I think like BNP, that was a high water mark, and even after that, I've attended sessions in the U.S., and even after that, there was a concern by the Department of Justice and OFAC, et cetera, that they weren't doing enough from an enforcement perspective. You had the Yates memo that came out, and I think the next step was going to be criminal prosecutions against individuals. But I think we've receded from that, and I'm like, I don't know if that's going to happen, and I like your comments on that. I'm interested in what your remark is. Clearly, DOJ, the State Department, and OFAC, they don't have any appetite, it seems, to go that far. But would New York do that?
Well, it's interesting. Actually, from an individual liability standpoint, no one's done more on this issue in the space than FINRA. So whether it's penalties against people at Raymond James or Brown Brothers, a few other smaller broker-dealers, they've actually done, I mean, $25,000 penalties and a massive deterrent. It is career-ending. But FINRA has done more on this than anyone. New York, you know, the non-negotiable portion of any of these settlement agreements has certainly been the forced termination of certain staff. You saw this at Commerzbank, at BNP, and a number of others. You know, I think actually what we saw with Megabank, which was a large Taiwanese bank operating in the U.S., is that the local government in Taiwan, as a result of the action in New York, they put the chairman and president of the bank in jail. And they charged the general manager in New York with a variety of crimes in Taiwan. So the spillover I'm seeing and spending enough time on planes and around the world is that I think a lot of governments are getting sick of being embarrassed by the U.S., that their institutions are being made examples of in the U.S., in New York, and so they're almost taking additional steps locally in the wake of enforcement actions in the U.S., which kind of compounds the problem. But, I mean, the enforcement environment is there. The Hyder case is still pending. Tom Hyder, who was the CCO at MoneyGram, is still facing charges of essentially negligence in his duties that led to $1 million civil penalty that they're attempting to capture from him. But there isn't a lot of talk beyond that. And the Yates memo got a lot of noise, but that was always the DOJ's approach. It's just Sally was very good about getting press for this, certainly on the way out, which became obvious. Right. But you know, the personal liability point with the New York DFS 504 regulation is a big part of this. Now, for those of you who are seeing, the initial 504 rule talked about criminal liability, which DFS is a civil agency. It can't levy criminal penalties. They took that out of the final rule, but they did amend it to state that we will go after the companies, individuals to the fullest authority that we have, which is fairly extensive. But I don't think there's been much talk as of late of cases like Hyder. I think that one's pretty unique in how the DOJ made an example of him and FinCEN made an example of him ultimately. But with the 504 regulation in particular, for banks operating in New York State, that's a significant debate that we're a party to with a lot of institutions of who's even signing this because of the liability implications for you signing this and your program doesn't comply with the 22 distinct requirements of 504. So I think the mechanism is there. It will be interesting to see. I mean, you're right, all the big penalties that have come out, I mean, you know, what BNP did and you know, that being somewhat of an isolated issue, I mean, there's still more of these problems that linger with institutions. What we're seeing now is Asian banks are being targeted by the U.S. government because the focus had been on Europe, and I think they've pretty much cleaned up all of those from a penalty standpoint, but now this is moving east. And these are violations that, as we're involved with them, we're seeing are actually, by the numbers, BNP-sized violations, pre-settlement amounts. So there's still more to do in terms of enforcement, but that personal liability that is still scaring people significantly in the U.S. and significantly for foreign banks operating in the U.S. and what that reach means for kind of head office or the extraterritorial touch points that it can have. But there hasn't been much talk beyond what's already out there.
I think what we're seeing, quite frankly, is opportunistic prosecution, but not, you know, a big program where they're saying, you know, we've got to get one in every case. That's unlikely to happen.
But I mean, if you look at some of the enforcement trends, so the new DFS under Superintendent Bulow versus Ben Lawsky, there's been an interesting change. So while Ben Lawsky's regime, in particular Matt Anderson, who was his PR guy, was really good at leaking things to the press, this one's taking a more measured approach. However, if you actually read the enforcement actions, Megabank or Agricultural Bank of China were twice the length of Standard Chartered by pages. So they're getting more voluminous in how they're actually spelling out what happened. They're taking out some of the, well, they're amending the editorial approach that Lawsky had and kind of focusing more on the facts, but they are getting somewhat dramatic in how they're reading it out. So it is going to be an interesting dynamic to watch what happens. And I know that there's still tension between the federal government and the DFS, because the DFS still, and the ABC and the Megabank cases, they went ahead of the federal government and the Board of Governors. So it kind of, again, throws into question some of the penalties that are coming out there, because I think the Fed has always taken a more measured approach, and I don't just say this because I used to work there. I mean, generally, the dollar-sized penalties are smaller, and the way in which they go about penalties is more measured. But this is creating some problems because you have DFS going out, again, similar to Standard Chartered a few years ago, levying penalties, and now it basically challenges the Fed to see what they're going to do, because you don't want to go after the bank with a duplicate penalty for really the same issues. But from a personal liability standpoint, it is coming up in all of the exams we're dealing with, but it seems more like a veiled threat than anything else.
Yeah, okay. Perfect. Well, so moving on to our next section. So let's get a little bit more specific around sanctions programs that the institutions have, right? So in wake of where we headed, what the trends are, where the overall environment is going, how do you think the programs within the institutions need to evolve? Especially, let's focus, I think, on technology, data, and the people aspect, and then how that needs to evolve. What are the challenges we see? You guys see in U.S. and Fred, and we can comment on the Canadian landscape. How do you empower the clients going forward?
Yeah, and I mean, I think for those of you who've seen the Clearinghouse report from last week that talked about basically the wasted effort that's being done for AML and sanctions monitoring, which, as all of you know, is pretty correct. The amount of time you spend on dealing and triaging with alerts that are useless, essentially, is significant. So I think what we are going to see, hopefully, with this new administration, a revised approach for how the expectations around monitoring are carried out. Nevertheless, we're still seeing two siloed approaches to AML and sanctions where the data is not leveraged as best as possible. So more unified case management efforts, the intelligence, the FIU type efforts trying to join up the work more closely between AML and sanctions and case referrals between the teams. But the challenge is coming in the form of the regulators themselves. There's a lot of banks under monitorship right now in the U.S., and that's now in every enforcement action coming out of the U.S. You're getting a monitor, even if it's $150 million, you're getting a monitor.
Your new friend that wants to help you.
You know, and your new friend who you can't negotiate with, who stays with you for, it's really bad. I mean, that is getting bad. The challenge is there's very few experienced monitors. There's a couple that are turning up in multiple places. Most notably, the monitor at Standard Chartered is shown up elsewhere. But we're seeing a few other banks that had very significant issues where the monitor actually came in and missed all of the problems. Like, oh, everything looks good. It's been 8 months. Clearly, everything isn't good. But the regulators, so it gives the banks a false sense of comfort because the regulators are coming back and then basically challenging what the monitor did. Not the DFS because they can't challenge their own selection, but the federal supervisors are doing that. What the problem becomes is for all of these banks under monitorship that had significant enforcement action, they are moving the needle. They are moving towards more advanced analytics and different types of platforms to carry out monitoring that you might not be, they're not the Actimized solutions, they're not FercoSoft, they're other more next generation tools that they're experimenting with. But the regulators see that and they're, ooh, this looks interesting, why aren't you doing this? And that is going to create a new problem.
You get a boomerang effect.
I mean, all of the expectations and the program remediations that some banks have done that was really out of necessity to appease the regulators might not be something that every bank needs to do. And I spend a lot of time counseling banks in the enforcement action process to really take the time to define your world and explain why what you're doing is reasonable, to kind of push back on, well, HSBC is doing this. Like, well, we are like a 20th of the size of HSBC and our problems were smaller. So that is the new problem, is they're filling their head with these remediation standards that aren't necessarily something that everyone should be doing. And because of the lack of prescription in the U.S. regime, it is difficult to push back on it. It's an examiner in your face telling you this is what you should be doing, and you have nothing else in writing to turn to say, well, show me where it says I have to do this. So that is the next problem in terms of dealing with these type of issues. A lot of it around technology expectations, around tuning and validation, which 504, for those of you operating in New York, will hopefully level the playing field on, at least in terms of the prescription that comes out. And what we're hearing is most likely some of the elements of the final rule of 504 will make their way into the next iteration of the FFIEC manual, because most of you are doing a lot of this anyway. Now, I mean, the linkage between TM scenarios and your risk assessment, I mean, that's not something that's universally done. It always should have been in compliance theory, but to actually draw that linkage directly isn't something that everyone is universally doing. But the concern is between New York and all the work being done by monitors really related to New York-related penalties, that it's moving a bar forward to standards that aren't exactly realistic for everyone. And we're finding more and more foreign banks not willing to push back, which is generally what I spend the bulk of my time doing, is giving the talking points to try and basically stand your ground, that what you're doing is reasonable, and let them challenge that it's not. And if they're saying it's not, explain why. And most of the time what we see when people do make that attempt is they'll talk about things that we're seeing at banks like BNP and Standard Chartered and Deutsche and others. And in no way is what those banks doing reflective of a practice that should be something that's universal. And some of this is, I think HSBC was one of the greatest examples of this. from a people standpoint, the way in which they staffed up resources went so far beyond what a new normal would look like that it did begin to fill regulators' heads with, well, you need to have 3,000 people clearing alerts across the country.
Right.
And as we all know, I mean, the goal is to try and get the fewest best alerts possible, not just dump resources at the problem and then try and manage it that way. So that is becoming the bigger problem, is defending what is reasonable, unfortunately.
Right. Comment on that, because the frustration that I find is the lack of experience, particularly even in the case of the DFS and their examiners. I've locked horns with their examiners, and I've done exactly that. Say, you know, describe, we're a relatively small bank in that market. We have a very low risk portfolio. It's primarily institutional. You try to explain to them, we're actually following the FinCEN guidelines. We're taking a risk-based approach. You know, and try to explain just sort of how we actually do our screening. And the reason why this came up as a concern is they gave us one single name, and they said, run this through your filter, did it hit? And the answer was, no, it is one single name. Intentionally, we set the filter so it doesn't hit, so you don't get too many false positives. And the response I kept getting back was, well, as you're setting, are you set at 72%? Are you set at 72%? And I said, well, somewhat. I said, but the way the algorithm fires, you can't, it's not just a number. And you try to explain to them the complexity, right, of the screening and how the various algorithms work together. It's like talking to a wall. Yeah. It really was, right? So I hear what you're saying, but it doesn't, when they don't fundamentally understand how screening works, and it was very evident that this examiner didn't understand.
I mean, we've seen it on the AML side. I deal with an Asian bank operating in the U.S., in New York, smallish branch. They do almost entirely lending and participating in syndicated lending outfits. And they're getting challenged for why they don't have any cash-related scenarios in the transaction monitoring tool. Like, it's lending. Like, they don't take
We
cash.
don't do this.
Like, and, you know, it actually, it took 3 attempts with the DFS to get them done to, no, your TM program is faulty. Well, no, they designed a risk-based program for the business that they have, which was lending and not cash-related activity. So it is still something that we're seeing it's a problem. And, yeah, on the sanction side in particular, because, I mean, AML is easier to understand. The sanctions program, while everyone just, and I still hear regulators say, well, it's just names on a list. And, like, the amount of times that I'm grinding my teeth as I'm hearing that, I mean, they still don't understand. And even with varying calls, especially to the DFS to actually hire more experienced examiners, which they're not doing, that is still an issue. So, I mean, I mean, we've seen these type of attempts work with mixed success, and it really is 50-50 in terms of finding someone reasonable enough, getting an EIC who actually will listen, and if not, pushing it further up within the DFS.
I was going to say, I think the thing that we see more success is the kick up. You know, kick it up to the next level if you're really hitting a wall.
You know, the challenge is, though, what that means.
But they don't like that.
Yeah, that's I mean.
And that's exactly
no one, that's, you need to be completely confident in what you're putting out, and I mean, that is never, no one is 100% certain in anything anymore. But I mean, pushing things up to the superintendent's office and to the assistant superintendents that are responsible for supervision can be effective, but it's just weighing the consequences from the actual individual examiner, which it depends. I mean, we've actually seen that work. I mean, and it has turned out where the examiner comes back with a vengeance, but then you just go back up the chain. It's a nasty process, but it still ends up yielding better results. It's just in the moment it becomes a more painful examination exercise. So, I mean, you do have to weigh, and I mean, I was the CCO of a DFS-regulated company for 3 years, so I've been in these shoes myself. And it is uncomfortable, but I mean, if you're confident in your approach and what you're designing, I was always willing to fight. And I'd say 3/4 of the time it worked. Other times they attempted to downgrade our ratings in certain areas that were generally unfounded based on their standards that they were even using. But I mean, it's an uncomfortable situation to be in, and you really do have to kind of weigh the odds and also determine if that's the fight you want to pick versus maybe making some tweaks to your program. There's no good answer to this.
And that's a cost-benefit thing. You know, how much are you willing to fight versus how much it's going to cost you?
Can I ask a follow-up question? We're actually having this discussion before the sessions just about our various banks' approaches to triage and whether some of us have moved the sanction screening functions or escalations into an FIU. Some keep it separate. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, we're generally seeing the first level alert clearing done in an ops-like function that's really owned by the first line, but all of the escalations get kicked to a second line function that'll serve in an FIU-like capacity. And what we're seeing more is these FIUs are, you'd have kind of the sanctions triage team and the AML triage team, and we're seeing that brought together a little more from a variety of reasons. One, just trying to streamline operations. Two, a cross-training opportunity to try and leverage staff in more than one capacity, even in larger institutions. But we are seeing the first level work generally stay within an ops function in the organization, whether it's done in near-shoring or offshore, but some way to try and manage the costs on first level alert clearing. But we are seeing the consolidation of the FIU teams for AML and sanctions being more joined up. I think some of it's trial and error and experimenting to try and reduce the walls between the teams. I mean, some banks, you're seeing the chief sanctions officer have the equivalent authority in the organization, the head of AML, and they're both reporting up to the CCO, and that's a model that for some of the larger U.S. banks we're seeing movement towards. But we are seeing more movement towards consolidation of the alert clearing efforts among singular teams. Obviously, you've got teams that are focused on sanctions alerts and AML alerts, but they're ultimately managed by the same groups in a more closer kind of teaming structure.
Yeah, and I actually see that as a deterrent or detrimental, right? Because from a sanctions perspective, I keep my team together and they handle just sanctions issues. So you actually have two levels, so like my second and third level work closely together. The second level is that they actually can see more complex files. They get exposure, particularly the SSI type of sanctions, right, where they are much more complicated, and their learning and actually their awareness of issues is much higher than if they were in just a strictly, I have to say, it's a triage function when you're looking at an FIU and you're just running alerts and you're going through numbers, you're kind of going through the motions. That was my view of it. I definitely there are efficiencies there, but I think you have to balance that with.
Yeah, I mean, you still have teams. It's not everybody doing everything, so I don't mean to portray it like that, but it's trying to at least manage the teams under one umbrella to try and keep some of the efficiencies there. There's still sanctions teams doing those type of detailed investigations and folks that are focused more on the TM side and the SAR-related investigations, but they're rolling up more closely to the same management rather than keeping them somewhat isolated. I mean, it still serves the same purpose, but I'm sure you guys are seeing this. There's a lot of movement in these roles now, and so it's a retention attempt that we're seeing some banks doing to try and give more opportunities rather than keeping people in those pure sanctions or pure AML functions. So they're still doing that in their own pods, but they're working to try and keep them as one team rather than the sanctions team and the AML alert clearing team.
Stephen, do you also have, other than just kind of the challenge of having specialized knowledge and sanctions capabilities and so forth, do you also have any data technology issues because of which you don't think FIU makes sense for you? Like, is there?
Well, in a way, right? Because I mean, the number of like from an alert perspective, the cases from a sanctions perspective are much lower than in AML.
Yeah.
Right? So they're not used to case creation as much, whereas it's much for frequent, like for transaction monitoring. I mean, that's one regard. The other challenge I had is on the training front, right? Like by keeping them close together, they're exposed to regular training that I expose everybody on my team to. So like when, new refreshers on Russia and Iran, et cetera, right? I mean, it would just make it a little more difficult if they were in a different team and I don't actually see them like on a regular basis, even though they're providing that function for my team. So that it was really a real estate type of issue, just having them in close proximity. Like if we were all together in like one large group, it would be less of an issue. Right? I don't really have a problem like from a employee retention perspective because I do have upward movement within, like you go from a first level analyst and you get promoted to a senior analyst within sanctions and then up to like the escalations group, right? So I think there is a career progression path. And from what I found, like the folks, they have had exposure to a high risk team and also investigations. They didn't like it as much. They just didn't find it as much. They get a bit of like I say, like an adrenaline rush just from the risk factor, and you have to be careful, et cetera, right? And then hard, but it's also the familiarity, like what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, right? What to look for. So.
Another question or comment?
You know, and hi, Lynette from TD. I'm with Stephen. I actually support a segregated model, and that's how we're structured today. I think there's value in shared technology for sure, and that's where there's a challenge for me right now is when cases are escalated, it's in isolation, and there can be AML and sanctions implications, and we've got two separate files. And AML Group has a much better system than we do. So what was the other point that I was going to make? Yeah, so technology, and I wanted to ask you what you thought the incremental value or benefit would be, because I've listened to you and I really don't see it other than reporting up to one manager, which I think there's also challenges too, because you're now asking someone to have at the manager level that subject matter expertise in sanctions and AML, and that can be a challenge to keep on top of on the group.
I mean, we're seeing regulators in the U.S. talk more and more about convergence. So they're looking to try and bring together more of these disparate teams from a data and infrastructure standpoint to try and manage potential shared issues that might not necessarily be caught in isolation. So that was generally the driving factor. We're also seeing them talk about trying to integrate cyber-related events into these overall efforts and fraud as well. So while no one's doing that in practice, and I would agree that doing that in one unit doesn't make a ton of sense, the regulators have begun to pick up on the convergence thread through, it's seeming like some sort of industry outreach, because we're not seeing anyone actually behave in that manner. But I mean, purely from an AML and sanctions standpoint, I do see the value in ensuring that you're trying to keep the teams closer together. Again, I agree, it's different subject matter areas that are both looking for slightly different anomalies and different reporting paths, but it's looking for the potential shared opportunities from a risk management standpoint that sometimes can get missed in aggregating to bigger cases. If you have a client with a sanctions issue and an AML issue, ensuring quicker identification of those issues to try and manage the de-risking conversation, which we find sometimes takes longer to actually detect when the teams are operating more separately. And again, most people are doing it in the way you're describing it. I don't want to...
And I think that we're doing our folks a disservice if we say that my team may on more cases than not miss suspicious activity and not triage over to or hand off over to the AML. So we're all trained. The AML people are trained. You see an indicia of sanctions, bunt it up to the sanctions team. So I think we have that if our staff are properly trained.
Yeah, training and
it would happen the same way within a group that's converged, right? So I guess I'm failing.
Oh, but to your point, I think technology plays a big role in this, right? Like, I mean, whether it's transaction monitoring or sanctions, ideally you want a holistic view to be able to see not just if you have sanctions hits from a payment, you also see any transaction monitoring rules that may have fired, right, at the same time. So then you can triage it appropriately to direct it to the right team.
Well, and the challenge in those scenarios is who's looking, who's running point at that point, which is why we're trying to see some of these efforts bring it together more to try and understand from a KYC standpoint, from a sheer risk management standpoint, what to do. Because you do see opportunities where you have a client that's got issues related to sanctions alerts and issues related to AML alerts. And in a lot of instances, your risk appetite might not allow you to even keep them as a customer. So some of this, what we're seeing is just a movement to speeding up the process of de-risking and identifying those unified issues, which technology does make a big point to help in having a singular case management tool that can link the sanctions-related issues against the AML issues for the same client, which obviously everyone's got limitations in terms of that view of customer, and the only clients that we're seeing that have a more holistic view of customer are those that have been through major enforcement actions that had to completely rebuild their KYC program and move towards single view of customer, where an integrated case management function that cuts across both systems would really lead to that. Again, this isn't a have-to situation, but it is something that we're seeing where there are some efficiency gains. Granted, it doesn't say that it's not to say that it's that much improved versus the current practices that you're talking about, but it is something that we're seeing improve the speed to exit clients that may potentially pose a risk that in isolation you might not feel tips the scale enough to actually get rid of them.
I mean, just to add to what you said, Dan, I think it's not differentiated maybe enough on at least the case management and then that part, but it is on the onboarding and when you go demarketing and those experience side, right? So on those tail ends, it does make a difference. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, where this has come up is where regulators have challenged some of the institutions that maintain clients that have had discrete issues for sanctions and AML. And the question is, well, why are they still a client? If you file 2 SARs and you've had multiple blocking reports related to this client's activity.
Why do you still have?
And the thing is, ultimately, they'll get rid of them. The challenge that we're hearing now is, why is it taking so long to get rid of them? And so part of it is the efforts that are being done in isolation and the relative speed in which you're getting those escalations done and how they're brought together, which, again, it might not be the fairest argument. A lot of these institutions are ultimately de-risking and getting rid of the customers. Now the challenge is, well, why did it take 6 weeks to get rid of the customer? Which isn't entirely fair, but it's another issue that we're seeing come up. But again, it might not be fair, but you have to respond to it. So that's, you're seeing people respond.
Whoever said they had to be fair, right?
But you're seeing people respond, and again, it changes the dynamic of what's the new approach, which might not be something that's needed industry-wide, but it's something that you should be aware of that some people are dealing with, which it just keeps changing their perspective. You can't show them new things. It's like my 5-year-old. Then they just get interested in that. It really is an issue in terms of
shiny new toy.
It is. I mean, that is the problem that we're seeing. And there's not really a solution for that.
I just want to make a point, too, because for most of the people here today, I mean, you have a very sophisticated or a much more sophisticated program than some of your clients. And I think one of the things we're seeing is that there are a lot of people out there that you're lending to or that are on the other side of you that, you know, don't have anywhere near the system and the processes and the technology that you have. And so, you know, while you may be okay, you know, what we're seeing is people coming to us with really rudimentary questions. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, you know, like, look at your footprint, look at where you're selling, look at what you're doing, and you mean you don't even have a sanctions policy? I mean, we're talking basic level. So I think one of the things that, from our standpoint, we're seeing time and time again is the people outside of FS are at a completely different level in conversation, and yet, you know, these are the people that are causing, perhaps, you to get the reports you're getting.
So we expected the discussion to be this robust, and now we are at the third section of our discussion. What we wanted to do here was just kind of wrap all of this up and think about more of you know, the governance and oversight and how the operating model should look like for sanction, how it fits within 3 lines of defense and, you know, the broader risk appetite. And those are some of the issues, at least in Canadian regulatory environment, are much more relevant. We know many of our, you know, folks here and the clients are really looking at the duplication of efforts and, you know, testing testers and how the linkage with risk appetite is looking. So the overall construct, how does that fit in? So what's our panel's view on that?
Yeah, I mean, and everything you see on screen, none of this is new to most of you with the developed programs you have. So, I mean, what we're seeing more discussion on, and actually a question, how many of you treat your sanction screening algorithm as a model for model validation purposes? Do you treat it as a model for subject to model validation? Yeah, see, that's the one thing that U.S. banks aren't entirely in agreement on, and with 504, it's going to push that issue forward. So for those of you who are, good, because certainly New York is taking the approach that it is, but we've seen some of the largest banks in the U.S. still challenge that the sanction screening algorithm is in fact a model and subject to validation, which I've always questioned.
That the same model validation and regime and it's fallen under risk.
Sure.
Is that the same model validation and regime and independence that the risk models are falling under?
Like the capital models and the others?
I mean, wherever, yeah, no, I mean, I'm thinking more on the AML model validation side, so for the scenarios that you have in place, which no one challenges that, wherever that's done, whether that's done in your model risk management team or elsewhere, it is brought into that function. I mean, the challenges we've all seen is those MRM teams don't understand, they know credit models, they don't know AML and sanctions-related models. But we have seen more of a definitive push from the regulators to come out and state that the sanctions algorithm is a model and subject to validation, which we've seen successful arguments over the year against that. With 504, it's certainly changing that.
And sorry, just to add on the comment. Right, the mic's on, just everybody can hear.
Just to add on to that, I think, Dan, we are seeing a push here to move it very aligned to what happens on the market risk side. So maybe this is one instance where, unfortunately, in Canada, we're ahead of the pack from what your comments are for you.
Yeah, Canadian institutions, at least as far as we know, have been on the journey of this whole model governance much more effectively, and there is that sort of all-encompassing discussion. Bye-bye.
Yeah, and then Stephen, to your point, I mean, we are seeing a lot of challenges around the thresholds that are set in the system, and regulators coming in with some preconceived notion of what the right threshold is and the right amount of alerts and false positives that you should be getting, which still there doesn't seem to be an antidote for. But I mean, the OCC and Fed are getting better at having more technical experts from a system standpoint. Some of them have actually hired people that have worked at these vendor companies, which is, it took them long enough to actually do that. There's not a lot of them, but there is more of that. But I mean, the focus on the technology elements and kind of the process with which you're generating alerts still continues to dominate a lot of the focus on examinations. But I mean, the concept of the right amount of alerts is still something that we're hearing a lot of as well. Like, are you getting 5% on transactions and 2% on customers? And they're coming in with some lens of what they think is reasonable that they are beginning to measure against, which, I mean, I don't know where some of the numbers are even coming from.
Yeah, the metrics are pretty squishy.
Yeah, I mean, so the statistics around what percentage of alerts you should be getting on your static data on your customer screening versus the alert percentage you should be getting on your transactional sides, which obviously would differ. And it's becoming an interesting explanation process to actually defend why, no, I mean, the process that we use is reasonable. This is why we're getting so many alerts and why the algorithm settings and threshold settings that we've put in place are appropriate for us. That still seems to be a regular challenge. The other more trivial point that we're seeing come up in a lot of examinations, particularly from the Fed, is the lack of a proper sanctions risk appetite statement, which we don't want to do business with designated people and with countries that are sanctioned in a way that we can't carry out business. But they're actually hitting institutions for not having, and it's literally a few sentences that can qualify as a sanctions risk appetite statement. So I've seen MRIAs and MRAs in the past 6 months on that point if you don't have a sanctions risk appetite statement. Like that one's pretty easy.
That's an easy fix.
But we have, I mean, most of the clients I've worked with have said, like, fine, they'll take us like 6 hours and we'll write you a sanctions risk appetite statement. But
Daniel, do they combine, have you seen the sanctions and the ML risk appetite statement come together?
We're seeing it separated. So from a policy standpoint, it being the preamble to your AML and sanctions policies at either a global or country-based level, but we're finding it there, and that's what they're asking for, similar to how over the past few years they've wanted separate AML and sanctions risk assessments. They want separate risk appetite statements, which, again, I mean, that is an extremely trivial point, but it is something that I wanted to raise that we're seeing more and more come up. I mean,
I haven't seen many AML risk appetite statements either. I would have to.
We see those on the back of enforcement actions generally.
Yeah,
what is
you see it more when they have to have them.
Exactly.
But it's coming into the routine exam process of, well, where's your risk appetite statement? Okay, there was that, and now it's where you have to separate this out, which it is, I mean, a slightly different standard for what you'd state for AML types of clients that you don't want to bank, and the kind of the general thresholds for where you draw the line. Sanctions is a lot easier because it's so much more black and white in terms of what's permissible and what isn't. But nevertheless, some of these trivial comments are creating additional issues from a regulatory response standpoint.
I do want to point out, too, I think we got a viewpoint from the DOJ very recently, which you're probably familiar with, on that evaluation of corporate compliance programs document. And I would strongly suggest that certainly people that do business in the U.S. take a look at that, because remember who that's from. That's their compliance consultant who's now at the DOJ, in-house at the DOJ, and she comes out of a financial services, background, and she's pushing them to look at any case that the DOJ is involved with from that lens. And while I don't think it breaks any ground, I think it is very important to know what they are viewing as the issues that they evaluate when they look at a program. And that could be the difference, and I've seen it be the difference between getting a monitor and not getting a monitor. In other words, if they pass muster and if your program, so to speak, hits the boxes, you're not going to get a monitor, whereas a lot of other people will. And that's a pretty important and very costly savings, if you can avoid it. And I agree with Dan. A lot of people are getting monitors, but with this mindset, I think you can make the affirmative case that we don't need one because we've done these things. And look at your own guidance, and here's what the guidance says we have to have, and here's what we have it. But if you haven't taken a look at that, I would strongly exhort you to take a look at that, because we've seen it applied by DOJ and SEC case after case after case.
But I would still say, on the whole, the enforcement actions that are rising to anything significant in terms of monitor imposition, in terms of a civil monetary penalty, they are still reserving them for the bad issues, and generally ones where some sort of illicit activity has gone through the bank, not just issues with your program structure or your program governance. State Street's probably a really good example of that. State Street had a horrendous AML program, but they couldn't find anything illegal went through the bank. So they got a consent order with no monetary penalty associated with it. And if you look at a lot of the other cases that have come out of the Fed and DFS where there's been a fine or a monitor attached, they've really done something pretty wrong in terms of the activity that's flowed through their institution.
They're just misguided. It wasn't wrong.
Yeah, right. I mean, it is important to note, while the enforcement environment in the U.S. is still what it is, the bad penalties are still reserved for truly illicit-related activity and not just program shortfalls, which I think I try and talk about when I do these types of events, just because it's very easy to go with the doom and gloom issues from a U.S. standpoint, but if you look at the ones from a dollar-for-dollar standpoint, there was illegal activity that's gone through the bank. Those weren't the ones that just you could have shored up your governance or you're missing a risk appetite statement. That is the difference, really, that separates the monetary penalties versus the non-monetary penalties, the non-public agreements, those type of issues. And I think it'll remain that way, because you do have to draw the line somewhere for how can you calculate a penalty against just program shortcomings. It's easy when they've actually done something illegal. That one makes it much easier, but I can't see that changing, because what you all know, every program has weaknesses and has room for improvement. It's always a continuous improvement model. And I think the regulators generally get that, and I think their triage is beginning to focus more on the illicit activities, the banks that had control weaknesses but that allowed certain things to happen. And I can't see that changing. Just they don't have the resources to go beyond that, so they have to triage themselves. But I do see in the issues that we're working, there's a very clear difference between the issues that will rise to a monetary penalty with a monitor imposed and ones that will have a very significant remediation but may have less external pressure in the form of penalties or monitors that are imposed as part of the agreements.
Okay, perfect. Well, we are at the clock, so with this discussion can go on. We'll take one final question if anybody has anything. Otherwise, we will consider this a wrap and then thank everyone. Well, that's great. So this is one of, as I said, this is one of the many, hopefully, the sessions we can host, and we'll reach out to you. Feel free to reach out to us for any specific topics you would like us to cover. We're happy to get, a bit more into details and have those discussions. We wanted to keep today's discussion a bit more broader and a bit more, sort of at a high level. But again, we'll reach out. Thank you so much for your time this morning and coming over. We really appreciate it. Hope we're doing something.
Thank you very, very much. Appreciate you being here this morning.
Thank you.